Okay, so this is Natalie. I'm going to go over the NNDSS project for the Vocab team today. Thank you to Grace for helping put together these slides and pull them from all sorts of other slide decks that we've used. If we have time at the end, I think Grace is going to have a couple documents open for us to look at, but we'll see how much time we've got. So I want to first just define what NNDSS is. It's the National Notifiable Diseases Surveillance System, and it's the system at CDC that collects the case notification data for the nationally notifiable diseases. Those diseases, conditions, events get defined by CSTE, and data are received by all jurisdictions at CDC. The information that CDC receives that gets populated into the weekly provisional data and the annual finalized data tables. There are some legacy methods of case notification available and still really widely used by jurisdictions. So there's faxed case report forms or other supplemental data that gets sent through systems like Decipher. There's the net flat file, which is really what we're trying to modernize here with NMI. And then there's the NBS, the NEDS-based system master message, if you are an NBS jurisdiction. So when APHL first started on this project, it was called NMI, and now CDC has moved more towards just calling it NNDSS, but NMI was the NNDSS Modernization Initiative, and the whole objective there was really just to start receiving better, more timely, higher quality data. It involved CDC developing these standardized message mapping guides, MMGs, for use for case notification messaging, and the MMGs were adopting a standardized HL7 V2 message structure. So CDC partnered with APHL to provide the TA for the jurisdictions to implement those MMGs, and we're still working on that today. When we talk about the MMGs, there are a lot of them. So it's not just one document. We currently have 20 finalized message mapping guides, meaning that jurisdictions can be implementing those MMGs in production, sending production information. There are 2 MMGs that are currently still in pilot status and 5 that are currently in development, although there are likely more that folks at CDC have at least been discussing. There's a table here on the right of the finalized MMG, and then how many conditions are included in that message mapping guide. I think that is important to look at as well, because it's not a one-to-one. Some of the MMGs are pretty complex, and within them, there are differences based on different conditions, so things grow exponentially. There's an interactive map here, and we can look at this if we have time, but it just shows for each message mapping guide what jurisdictions have that in production, and it's kind of fun to play with on the CDC website. Okay, so the APHL TA side of NNDSS. So we provide TA basically in 3 areas. So project management and business analysis, data standards, expertise, and workflow analysis, which is mainly where we fall as terminologists, and then the technical architecture expertise. Heather had this, our PM had this on a slide, and so we pulled it. I don't know if these numbers, they've probably increased since this was first presented earlier this year, but since 2015, APHL has provided TA to support 55 public health agencies and 282 MMG implementations. Okay, so what are our responsibilities as terminologists? One of the main things we do is work with CDC. We are providing and reviewing, providing feedback and reviewing all their artifacts. So as they are developing new message mapping guides for new conditions or updating message mapping guides that have been out there for a while, we review those, we provide them feedback. Same with the test cases that they develop to test implementation of those message mapping guides. We look at their data elements, the descriptions, the value sets that they're using, the identifiers that they have selected, and also if their test cases make sense. We try to offer both like the terminology standards perspective, but also just the jurisdiction perspective. If I received this document, would I be able to implement it? What types of questions would I have? And then off of every message mapping guide, we create an implementation spreadsheet for each one of those. That implementation spreadsheet is really our one-stop shop document. It combines multiple resources that a jurisdiction needs to construct the notification message into a single document. Those resources are here, but we've got the CDC FIN specification, which is kind of the underlying message structure document, Gen V2 message mapping guide data elements. So all the condition-specific MMGs are built on top of Gen V2, Gen being generic. We've got condition-specific MMG data elements, and then there is space for jurisdictions to include information about their local case report form, surveillance system data element, mappings. There's a lot of space for them to include information here. And so we mainly use this document, the implementation spreadsheet, for completing the gap analysis, where we ask a public health agency to compare what's currently being collected for a condition in their system to what CDC has requested in their specification. It's one of our first steps during implementation, but we use this document for a lot more. It gets sent to CDC. It's like the official record of what the jurisdiction's going to send. IT implementers sometimes use this depending on how they are setting things up in their system. So a lot of uses there. Okay, so then our other responsibility as terminologists is working with jurisdictions, and this is what takes up the majority of our time. So we serve as the terminology subject matter experts during any interaction basically with the jurisdiction for NNDSS TA. So that could be on cohort calls, just random TA sessions that we have with a jurisdiction, or via email. If they're emailing questions, we're the ones that are typically responding to those. We review the gap analysis, so the completed implementation spreadsheet when a jurisdiction has that. We validate their HL7V2 test messages, and then we create and maintain some internal tools that the jurisdictions use. So I already talked about the implementation spreadsheet, but we also, we use a validation template for HL7V2 message validation, which I'll show you a little snippet of in a second. And then we also have a local mapping template. This doesn't get used by everybody, but it is a way for jurisdictions to map their local values to the concepts from the CDC value sets. And so if they're using our template Rhapsody route, APHL's template Rhapsody route, they have to fill that out. And then sometimes they just use it as a good resource anyway. We have two models of technical assistance. So we really adopted the cohort approach, and that has been very successful, where we jurisdictions can join a cohort, they can collaborate with their fellow jurisdictions and kind of move through implementation together. We like to have around 4 to 6 jurisdictions in a cohort, although right now we have one with more than 10. So we're flexible there. But it's really nice because jurisdictions can learn from one another. We also have CDC typically on those meetings. So the program area for the message mapping guide or message mapping guides that we're working on in the cohort, and sometimes also onboarding specialists, so we can get questions answered really immediately a lot of times, and good discussion happens there. If it's NBS, NEDS-based system jurisdictions, we also typically have NBS vendor resources on the call, and so that way they can answer those questions and help out there as well. If there's not a cohort going on and a jurisdiction wants to work with us, we will provide individual TA, and so this can, again, if it's outside of a cohort, we will engage with them like this. Or if there's special circumstances, we're working with a number of jurisdictions right now who are replacing their surveillance systems, their integrated disease surveillance system, and so they're having to re-implement and onboard every message mapping guide. So we typically have individual TA with them. If a jurisdiction doesn't work with us in a cohort or on an individual basis, and they are just submit an onboarding package to CDC saying they're ready to onboard a guide, CDC will kick that over to us to review before they start working with the jurisdiction. for onboarding. And then Rhapsody route implementation. So I mentioned that we have an APHL template Rhapsody route that some jurisdictions utilize. And if they're working with us to implement that, they're working with John Park to implement that. But the terminologists typically help with that as well, with some mappings and setup. This is our TA process. Not going to go into detail on it. I've just highlighted a few of the steps where terminologists are really involved. We're kind of involved in all the steps, but I'd say we really own, the gap analysis review and making sure that's finalized, and then the validation of HL7 messages, which is a really iterative process up there. So gap analysis review, we're reviewing mappings. We are looking at priority data elements. So CDC identifies priority elements, and we need to make sure the jurisdiction is implementing those. And if not, they've provided sufficient justification for why they are not. We submit that feedback to the jurisdiction, go back and forth until something's clean and can be sent to CDC. And then CDC, the CDC program area, responsible for the conditions in that message mapping guide review. And then we will continue that review process through validation until onboarding, just to make sure things are in alignment with their test messages. Then we do the test message validation. So we are validating their HL7 messages. We're looking at structure. They send us text files. We're also validating content. So are they using appropriate values, but also is the content, validating that against what is expected from their test case scenario worksheet. NNDSS has a very strict validation process at CDC, and so we are really validating data element by data element. Are they sending what they said they were going to send? We use an Excel validation template to do that. We use CDC's METS validation tool, which is available online. And then we have an APHL developed Rhapsody validator that validates, there's a little stricter validation than METS. METS is going to mimic what the CDC validation that happens in production, which is good, but we catch some things in APHL Rhapsody validation that METS doesn't catch. This is just an example of the test case scenarios. This is the test case scenario worksheet the jurisdiction has to fill out. On the left side are all the data elements from the MMG. In the middle is the CDC test record that they're asking the jurisdiction to complete. And on the right, in that kind of pinky red column, is how a jurisdiction would fill that out. So again, we are validating data element by data element, whether they're sending what they said they were going to based on these test case scenarios. This is a little snippet from our validation template, which was developed by Susan, and it's in Excel. It uses a lot of very, very fancy formulas that I could not explain to you, but it helps us validate that what they say they're going to send in their test case scenario worksheet is actually what is included in their test messages. These are some snippets from our Rhapsody validator, the kind of information that we see there. So we see code discrepancies, code system discrepancies, syntax errors, and even inappropriate values. So if they're sending data elements that are not included within that message mapping guide. We compile all of that into validation feedback that we send back to the jurisdiction. This is just an example. We send it back in Excel. We usually go through many, many rounds of validation with jurisdictions before they're ready for onboarding. I think minimum is somewhere like maybe 2 or 3 rounds, and we have some jurisdictions who are up in the 30s and 40s and still not ready for validation or for onboarding with CDC. And finally, when we do the cohort approach, we do use Smartsheet. We use Smartsheet basically for most everything, although we are transitioning some things over to Confluence. But if a jurisdiction is in a cohort, one of the nice things is they have this cohort dashboard in Smartsheet where they really have all the information that they would need for the meeting, timeline, updates, links to all the documents, and questions that get brought up during the cohorts and the responses once we have those. Okay, so that is the end of my slides. I don't know where we're at on time, if we have time for Grace to maybe pull up a couple of the documents to show, or if there's any questions from the group.
I think we definitely have
Natalie,
time.
Jamie,
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit, this is dear to my heart. So you talked a little bit about the Rhapsody validator, and the profiles are a little more strict, the validation. Who creates those validation guidelines, and how is that updated through Rhapsody?
Yeah, so those are built by our Rhapsody folks. So John Park and Candace, and they really just take the message mapping guide and
Right.
put that information into tables that they use for the Rhapsody validator. I think they have to put, and Grace might be able to talk more to this, I think they have to put similar information together for our template Rhapsody route that we utilize, that some jurisdictions utilize. And so
Right.
there's similar tables that they put together for the Rhapsody validator. And then we can just drop files on AWS, Rhapsody picks them up and validates them for us and just kind of provides an output.
It's out the results, the comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so John and Candace does that. Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Grace. I'll just add some of the things that like the lookup tables that Natalie was referring to. They'll create tables, they being the like John and Candace, they'll create tables that kind of define which data elements are allowed to be in which MMGs according to the message profile identifier, and then which values can be in which data go with which data elements, and the value sets, things like that. So there's a lot of lookup tables set up to support that validation. I'll go ahead and share my screen, but are there any other questions while I'm setting my screen up? Thanks, Natalie. I think I'm sharing, do you see an Excel spreadsheet, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I just have an implementation spreadsheet pulled up. Happens to be for congenital syphilis, but we have one for every MMG. We've created one over the years for every MMG and every major version of an MMG as well. So this is version 1.1.2. There were, I think, probably 2 previous versions of the congenital syphilis MMG, and so we would have corresponding implementation spreadsheets for those as well. So these are all available on the CDC website for jurisdictions to access and download to support their gap analysis and mapping activities. We have it initially filtered by, not by condition. We initially have it filtered on the data element identifier, but to limit what is visible to just the data elements that the jurisdictions need to worry about mapping. But as Natalie mentioned, this document does include it compiles information from multiple resources, one of which is the FIN spec for case notifications. So that has some of the technical information on the various HL7 segments for the message, and like information on where in the message it goes, any implementation notes that might apply, length and data type requirements, etc. But again, jurisdictions will typically just be focused on data elements that they'll need to map. And so we have the document filtered like this. These initial columns are essentially pulled from the MMG that have information on all the different data elements. I'm trying to think, right, and then we'll have the Gen V2 data elements typically at the top, and that's the generic version 2 MMG on which most of the MMGs are built. Then below there will be the condition-specific data elements, in which case here it's congenital syphilis. The jurisdiction also has an opportunity over here to the right, starting in column AA, to use these columns to complete their mappings. This column AA is required, and this is where they'll indicate which of these data elements are will be included in their messages that will be sent to CDC. And they'll have options here to include, to say yes if they're already collecting it, yes if they're adding the data element to their system. So this will indicate that any legacy data that they have sent previously will not have this data element. Here they can select this on only certain conditions if this data element is only being sent for either certain conditions or certain circumstances, or maybe just a subset of the values and the value set are being sent, etc. And then no if they're not going to be sending that data element. The CDC priority column here, I was just in a column in a row for that has an R. These R's required indicate that these data elements are required for the structure of the HL7 message to be valid. If the data if an R data element is not included, then that message would fail validation. The other values for this column are 1, 2, and 3, and those are typically programmatic choices from the CDC program based on how high a priority that data element is for that program surveillance. So as I mentioned, this column is required. And then this column is conditionally required for them to explain any scenarios that they'll need to, for which the data element is being sent. And all of these subsequent columns are optional for the jurisdictions to include mapping, specific mapping information like the data element or the variable that's in their surveillance system, value set mapping, as much or as little as they want to use these columns, they can. And we see a wide variety. Some jurisdictions don't use these columns at all. Others have them completely filled out and they'll use them. You'll see dates and comments where they've sent them amongst their team to kind of discuss different data elements and how they may be mapping it, or if they were previously sending it or are no longer, etc. So there'll be a wide variety. This is a column that was recently, maybe within the last 2-ish years, has been added to implementation spreadsheets at the request of the CDC programs. They've wanted to, and Natalie touched on this, programs wanted to know why jurisdictions were not able to send any high priority data elements. So these are CDC priority 1 or 2 data elements. So if a jurisdiction is not going to be sending one of these high priority data elements, they'll be asked to include in this column either a justification for why they're not able to send it, or a plan for them to send that in the future. Like the jurisdiction will revisit this data element next year in 2026 to see if we can send it, or we don't have the resources to collect this data right now, or we're not able to send this per our jurisdiction, like state regulations or whatever the case may be. The implementation spreadsheet also has information on the data types that pertain to each data element. There's a column for data types in here somewhere. I'm not sure how, because these gray columns are also hidden, I guess by default, when the implementation spreadsheet is downloaded from the CDC website. And I'm not sure how many jurisdictions actually unhide these and reference these columns. They include a little bit more technical information about the HL7 structure. some of the technical staff may reference these, but I think once a jurisdiction kind of has their message building process in place, they may not reference these as much any longer. Any questions about the implementation spreadsheet? As Natalie said, once they've completed all of their information here, they will submit that to APHL and we will review that. Some jurisdictions will say, you know, this is a draft, this is our first, you know, our first pass at it, and it won't quite be complete, and we'll go ahead and review what's there and send it back, and it's a very iterative process. All right, and then the one other thing that I wanted to show just really briefly was an interactive map that Natalie mentioned, reference in the slides. This is, I'm not sure when this became available, but I've just recently discovered it. I think Natalie mentioned it, and it's really cool because you're able to select from the MMG that you're interested in. Let's look at congenital syphilis since that's the implementation spreadsheet we're looking at. And you can see all the jurisdictions that have that in production. No jurisdictions are piloting or well, the pilot is complete for that one, or onboarding that right now, but jurisdictions probably will be in onboarding fairly soon because we are working on a couple of cohorts for congenital syphilis. So once the jurisdiction, you know, completes the cohort and has gotten their test messages and gap analysis completely validated, then we send them off to onboarding, and that's when that status will change. Oh, I guess there's Puerto Rico down here. I missed that. Yeah, so this is there's also a table that you can download to see the information in table format, but I kind of like the map. It's cool to see. Gen V2 is definitely the MMG that has the most completion, and this is probably because so many of the MMGs are based on Gen V2, so it's one that we typically recommend jurisdictions start with in their implementation. Any questions or comments about the map or anything that Natalie and I have mentioned? Okie dokie. I think that's all for us then.
All right, Wiki had to step away for a little bit, so she made me host. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. And I'm going to stop the recording now.